Hello everyone and welcome back to another beginner Blender tutorial. Today I'm going to be showing you the settings I use for my Blender startup file, which is essentially the file that appears in Blender when you create something new. By default, you will probably have a scene that looks like this. A point lamp, a camera, and a default cube, as people call it. I like to remove all these from my scene for my default startup file. So all I'm going to do in my new Blender file is press A and then press X. And now everything in the scene will delete. I'm not going to add anything on my scene because I don't really need anything, and I'm going to switch to these render settings. I've gone over these in other videos, but I'm going to use this as a video to cover it from now on. So first of all, in Eevee, I like to have my render and viewport at 125 each. The reason I have my viewport at 125 is so I can make the most of Eevee's real-time rendering and get a nice look at what the final render will look like. For ambient occlusion, I'll make sure it's switched on, and I'll set it to around 0.5, although I may mess around with the values depending on what scene I use. If you're new to Blender, don't worry about that too much, just make sure it's on 0.5. Factor of 1 and a trace precision of 0.25. Make sure all these boxes are checked. As for bloom, I have it on 0.5 by default, but you can meddle with it depending on your scene to get a nicer result. Again, if you're a Blender beginner, don't worry about it too much, just set it to 0.5 and leave it at that. All these values are like this by default, I believe, but just make sure to double check and make sure they're all the same. Finally, for screen space reflections, I turn off half res trace and turn on refraction, trace precision to 1, and max roughness to around 0.76 or 0.75. Finally, probably one of the most important settings for rendering in Eevee, I have my shadows cube size set to 4096 and my cascade to 4096. This will make the quality of the shadows in Eevee look much better. You can also turn on high bit depth and soft shadows, which is a very important setting here. So make sure you have those on as well if you want to get nice results in Eevee. Next, I'm going to switch to cycles and show you my defaults for cycles. As you can see here, I have my render value quite high. You could probably lower this a lot depending on what sort of scene you're making. I usually only use a render value this high for scenes which have a lot of glass and things that might cause fireflies. I always make sure I have this denoising value on, and I have it set to NLM. Under light paths, I have it set to the preset of full global illumination, which is 128 for all these values if you want to put them in manually. Also, clamping here, direct light is set to 5, indirect light is set to 10. I haven't messed with caustics much, but here are the values I have if you want to mimic my settings accurately. Now, because I'm using my CPU most of the time, I have my tile set to 16 by 16. If you're using a GPU, you're probably going to want to go for around like 256 or something like that by 256. So essentially, if you're rendering with a CPU, use a low number like 16px, and if you're using a GPU, use a higher number like 256. Don't go overboard though, because if you use a ridiculously low number or a ridiculously high number, you won't get a good time-saving result. Up here at the top of render properties, you can see that I have my device set to CPU. If you're using your GPU, just click it here. Though you may need to go into settings, so just press edit and then preferences. You might not be able to see this box, but essentially all I need to do is click system and go to either CUDA if you're using a NVIDIA GPU, or OpenCL if you're using a Radeon one like mine. That's everything you need to know about setting up your GPU. Now I'm going to quickly go over something I have here in the timeline. So I have this thing here set to timeline, so make sure this is on this clock here, and I'm going to change this keying. Make sure it is on location, rotation and scale. If you want to choose a different preset and you kind of know what you're doing, then you can switch that, but if you're a beginner, location and rotation and scale should do the job for you. Make sure it's on keyframe, although it is by default, and I make sure this auto keyframe insert keying set is switched on, so it should be highlighted blue, and this is on add and replace. Also in output properties, I have my resolution under dimensions, which is essentially the resolution your camera renders at. I have it 1920 by 1920, which will have a nice HD square shape. Because I put a lot of images on Instagram, that's why I've chosen that. There are also some presets here you can choose, so there's like 4K, Full HD, and you can choose from those. Frame rate, have it on 30 frames per second by default, but that's completely up to you what you want to go for. Frames per second is essentially how many frames pass in 1 second. You can watch my animation tutorial if you want to learn more about this, which is a little further on in the beginner tutorial playlist. Alright, so now all I need to do is save this as my default setup. So I'll come to File and just left click, and if I hover over Defaults, I can press this Save Startup File. And once I left click that Save Startup File again, make sure you do that. Whenever I close Blender and open it up again, this is what will come up. If you're worried that you haven't saved it properly, I recommend saving this file by just pressing File and then Save or Ctrl S, choosing your directory, and you can open it up again and try saving it as default startup file again if you happen to accidentally misclick something when you're setting the default and it doesn't work. But that should be pretty much everything you need to know. If you have any questions about this, make sure to let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next Blender tutorial. Thank you for watching.